Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, navigating the new normal, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society and technology, real estate and medicine, technology and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Cloud. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, AFRMC, a 501c3 national American charitable organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence, as it serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. Please support our mission in this free public affairs program with a donation of any amount. Visit us, American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, online and donate at AFRMC.org. Join us on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. We depend on you, our audience's support, to help the hospital in Israel. So thank you if you can contribute any amount. Our host and moderator for Global Connections is Robert Siegel, former host of All Things Considered on National Public Radio for 31 years. Over the course of an hour each month, Global Connections features guests who Robert Siegel interviews as they explore important issues in our world. Today's Global Connections topic is, what's next in Washington, D.C. in 2024? We thank our special guests, Emily Bazelon of the New York Times Magazine, E.J. Dionne Jr. of the Brookings Institution, and Aaron David Miller of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And now, Global Connections with Robert Siegel.
Thank you, Josh. Every November, we take stock of where the latest elections have left us and what issues are likely to occupy us until the next November. In this case, next year is the big one. The 2023 political season, like any year prior to a presidential year, witnessed relatively few elections, unless you count the choice of a new House Speaker. Congress wasn't up for re-election, and relatively few governorships were also. But some big trends have become obvious. The Republicans in Washington, certainly House Republicans, have handed leadership over to the party's MAGA wing and seem at best inexperienced at governing, if not at sometimes uninterested in doing so. Joe Biden presides over a strong recovering economy. He's passed an ambitious program and seems to get little in the way of public approval or admiration for either accomplishment. Abortion continues to drive up voter turnout, especially by women, and to deliver gains for Democrats. And foreign policy, once marked by bipartisanship, exhibits unusual divisions. The Democrats' left wing is anxious over support for Israel, and the Republicans' right wing seems soft on support for Ukraine. Well, where are we headed? What might be in store for us in the coming year? We have three very thoughtful panelists to address those and other questions. And you can contribute your questions to the discussion, which we could get to in the second half hour, by using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Our first panelist is E.J. Dionne, a Washington Post columnist and Georgetown University professor of government. E.J. writes about politics. His most recent book, written with Miles Rappaport, is 100% Democracy, The Case for Universal Voting. E.J., thanks for joining us once again. It's good to see you.
Robert, it's great to be with you always. Thank you.
Let's start with the people who are in office in Washington, leading their parties, and the prospects for some legislative cooperation between them. President Biden faces re-election next year. Republican Mike Johnson has just begun as Speaker. Should we just count on keeping the national parks open as a reasonable accomplishment for this pair, or could we expect something actually being accomplished by government?
No, unfortunately, in legislative terms, I think keeping the government open will be the big accomplishment between now and the end of the year. And I think it was fascinating that Speaker Mike Johnson, clearly from the right wing of the party, he opposed the deal to keep the government open that that Kevin McCarthy, the former speaker, pushed through with Democratic votes. And lo and behold, Johnson proposes something to keep the government open that doesn't include all the cuts in government that the right wing of his caucus wanted. And he had to rely on Democrats again to get that through. It's an oddly configured proposal where parts of the government will expire, funding will expire in mid-January and the rest in February. That was a concession to the right. It really didn't help him at all with the right wing. I think insofar as you see government action, I think you'll probably see it from President Biden, either with executive orders or announcements. I think he knows, looking at the polls, that he needs to do something visible on prices. And by the way, I do think the right way to think about this is not inflation, which is down, but prices which for people going into a store are still higher than they were in 2020. It's the spike in 2022 that is still there. I think that's what's hurting Biden. I think you're going to hear a lot from him about how he's trying to bring down prescription drugs and other prices. I suspect he's going to try to move some on immigration. I think that is the other issue the Republicans think could work hard against him. And as you mentioned, abortion is the issue that really, really hurt Republicans in these off year elections. I think we'll hear about that. And then finally, I think Biden will be talking a lot about projects happening around the country because of what he passed. His offensive on Bidenomics didn't work. I think that word will disappear. And I think he's going to become much more concrete about this factory here and that road there, and really copy the campaign that Andy Beshear ran, the Democrat who got reelected as governor of Kentucky, who was very much about all the concrete things he did, often with the help from the Biden program, without ever mentioning Joe Biden's name in a state where Biden is very unpopular.
According to the polls, we're headed toward a Biden-Trump rematch. The Economist, I should say, calls that an unpopularity contest and writes the following, which I want to hear what your thoughts are. The main issue in the election, according to the magazine, will not be anything conventional like the economy or foreign policy, but whether either man is fit to serve in the office. Both men will portray the other as a harbinger of the end of the country, and most members of their parties will subscribe to these competing eschatologies. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, I approve of any sentence that uses the word eschatologies. And it's not entirely wrong about how each side looks at the other with extraordinary dread. I think the driving force in American politics right now, as the political scientist Alan Abramowitz has written, is negative partisanship. And we are polarized not because we really, really, really love our own parties, but because we really despise and fear the other party. I have a bit more sympathy, I suspect, for Biden and the Biden record than the person who wrote that. And I do think Biden has a good record to run on. But I also think the presidential elections are more often than we like to acknowledge about negative verdicts on someone else. If you think back to Carter and Reagan, there were a lot of people who had doubts about Ronald Reagan and finally turned to him at the end, not because they were Reagan lovers, but because they just didn't want to take another Biden term. Even FDR and Herbert Hoover, way back in 1932, there were doubts about FDR, but people wanted to throw Hoover out. What's really odd about this election is we really haven't seen a former president on the ballot again since Teddy Roosevelt back in 1912 when he ran as a third-party progressive candidate. And we haven't seen a president come right back in to run again since Grover Cleveland back in 1892. So what you're going to have is two records stacked against each other. The Economist is right in implying that an awful lot of voters dislike both candidates. That's true right now. But I think the notion of a negative verdict is not new. And I think this will be a campaign primarily about which person do you not want in the White House for 4 years.
Later on, during our discussion period in the second half hour, we'll get to the unusual circumstances of Donald Trump, who may be on trial at least in one jurisdiction during much of the campaign, if not more than that. But EJ, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Hang in with us, and we'll come back to you. EJ Dionne. That's EJ Dionne, and we've been talking about the presidency and the Congress so far, but Emily Bazelon was our next panelist, is equally concerned about the courts. She's a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine, and she's also the Truman Capote Fellow for Creative Writing and Law at Yale Law School. She went to Yale Law School and clerked on the U.S. Court of Appeals. She's since been editor of Slate and written books about bullying and about mass incarceration. Emily Bazelon, thank you very much for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
The past couple of years, the Supreme Court has made some big precedent-shattering decisions on abortion, on affirmative action, and university admissions. Is there anything in this year's docket with that kind of potential impact on society?
That's a great question. It has been so earth-shattering. It's sort of hard to come up with anything equivalent. I mean, I think what's going to happen in this term is we're going to see the court returning to some issues that it maybe hoped settled, but did not. It's very likely that there'll be another big abortion case on the docket about the Food and Drug Administration's authority to regulate one of the drugs used for medication abortions, one of the abortion pills. So that will be a returning issue. And then the court might have also hoped to settle this question of when states and cities can pass restrictions on guns, but the court just heard a case out of Texas that was really that could help the court, I think, really clarify the rules, the standards for when cities and states can still continue to regulate guns, despite the court's major decision saying that there's an individual right to bear arms in the Second Amendment. And then, interestingly, we're going to see, and we already are seeing, big cases about social media, which the court hasn't really addressed some of the big questions that arise about free speech protections, the sort of scope of the First Amendment when social media platforms are at stake, because those are private companies. They've become a sort of quasi-public square. And yet, because they're private companies, legally speaking, they're really much more like shopping malls where they can actually regulate speech. And so the court's going to step in there. And I guess the last very important dimension is the court's effect on our democracy. And in the last few years, we've seen the court do a variety of things. Some of them seem to be protective of democracy. I think most importantly, the court rejected all of former President Trump's challenges to the 2020 election, and that mattered a great deal. But there obviously have been other decisions that, really allow for gerrymandering and other aspects, other things that largely Republicans have been doing to kind of change the rules of the game of the democracy or making it harder for people to vote. So continuing that line of cases, I think, is obviously a huge thing as we look forward to 2024.
I want to return and ask you more about the issue of abortion rights. You've written about campaigns to either enshrine abortion rights in state constitutions or pass other kinds of referenda, and I'm wondering whether there are lessons that have been learned in those campaigns, which we're likely to see still repeated in more states around the country. And do you accept the notion that people, say in Ohio, who voted to have a constitutional amendment protecting abortion, actually would exceed the number of people who might describe themselves as relatively open to abortion? That is, that the rights argument has traction that abortion itself doesn't have as an issue, I suppose.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it. I mean, look, when Justice Alito wrote the majority opinion for the conservatives on the court that overturned Roe versus Wade, Alito said, okay, well, we're going to leave this up to the voters in the states, and some of them are going to choose to have more restrictive rules than Roe, and others will choose to continue Roe. And in fact, and it's hard to imagine that Alito would have predicted this, in all 7 of the states where there have been voter ballot initiatives that have gone directly to voters, the abortion right side has won. And that's 7 states. It includes conservative states. You mentioned Ohio, also Kansas and Kentucky and Montana, Michigan, a purple state. And I think this is a big surprise. It was certainly not what I expected when the first of these elections took place in Kansas shortly after the court's decision in 2022. And I think you're right that it turns out that when you present voters with a choice, a very stark choice between a ban or a near ban on abortion and broad rights, voters are choosing the broad rights. And it turns out that in Ohio, a third of Republicans supported this ballot initiative. And the safer ground that I think Republicans and abortion opponents will hope to return to is one in which you're arguing over restrictions. So there is a right to abortion, but, is there a waiting period? Are there restrictions on abortions that take place later in pregnancy? Those are more popular stances for Republicans. But I think what we're seeing now is that now that we don't have Roe versus Wade, and the country's very aware of that, people understand that that kind of basic floor of constitutional protection is gone. And so something is really at stake here. And then you're seeing voters much more concerned about making sure that people have some access, that women have some access, as opposed to trying to make sure that you're imposing a lot of rules. Voters still don't like the idea of what people will call abortion on demand or using abortion as birth control. But when you're faced with like nothing or everything, the voters are choosing something. It's not everything, but it's a lot.
Have you heard of any Republican politicians or strategists saying, let's try to stop this? I mean, this is a loser. This is like prohibition. I mean, there'll be states that'll continue to be dry and counties where you can't get liquor, but basically this issue is a killer for us. Is that being said?
Well, it's certainly being said by Republican pollsters. So I interviewed a veteran Republican pollster in Michigan named Stephen Mitchell, and he was 100% on the record about this. Like this, we need to make this go away. The sooner it's over and sort of resettled, the better for Republicans. And there certainly are some former Republican officials, including a bunch of former governors in Ohio, who came out in favor of issue 1, which was the Ohio pro-rights ballot initiative. I think it is hard for current Republicans to take that stance. The official Republican Party stance still calls for basically zero abortion. And, you do see Glenn Youngkin in Virginia just try to run a play, which failed, but the play that he tried to run was a 15-week ban, a ban after 15 weeks of pregnancy. And he tried to say, this is a reasonable limit. This is like a middle compromise. And the voters, at least they said no to turning the Virginia legislature over to the Republicans. Yeah. So I think this really remains a big challenge for Republicans.
Yeah, it's a rare case, by the way, when you might hear Republicans appealing to what the norm is in Europe. Usually that's a Democratic argument, not a Republican one. I mentioned that you wrote a book about mass incarceration, and you wrote about the enormous power that prosecutors had acquired in recent decades, and you wrote about the prospects for reforming the system. I wonder, given what seems to be, at least in some cities, a pretty sharp rise in crime, and New York City electing a couple of years ago a very anti-crime, tough cop mayor, Washington D.C.'s mayor proposing a pretty sort of tough on crime package of getting more beds for detention rather than sending kids who've been arrested back out right away. Are we possibly seeing a swing of the pendulum back toward tougher law and order policies occasioned by some kind of increase in crime that we're experiencing?
Yeah, so my book came out in 2019, and it was frankly a very fortuitous moment for my book to come out, because I could make a very easy win-win argument for reform, for reducing the footprint of the criminal justice system, for less mass incarceration. And the argument was, look, crime is going down, and it's going down in places, New Jersey, the city of Philadelphia, et cetera, where we're seeing these more progressive policies. Then we have 2020 and 21, in which in many cities in the country, there is a rise in homicide, and some places there's also a rise in property crime. I don't want to make it seem like it was universal.
Right.
But, and also I want to make really clear that those rises, especially for violent crimes, were far, far lower than the highs we saw in the 1980s and 90s. However, a rise is bad, and people noticed. And there was a lot of trying to understand what was happening. I think it's still kind of too early to tell, but there's a consensus among experts landing in the realm of it's really important to remember the effects of the pandemic, and also on the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, that the relationship between communities and police in some places really broke down, and that lack of trust may have also contributed. So now what? We do see, I think, kind of sadly, inevitably, swing back to tougher law and order policies. It's not a solution that I think we have a lot of evidence is successful, but I cannot think of an era in modern American history in which crime was rising and people continued to decarcerate. There just seems to be this American, I would argue, pretty knee-jerk response. Well, we better just lock more people up, as opposed to thinking about other solutions, even though we have good evidence that things like cleaning up vacant lots, putting in better lighting systems, and then not to mention the sort of big root causes issues like better jobs and education, really do more to prevent crime. We seem to always just go for, this particular hammer for this nail. I also think it's really important to say that the homicide numbers are coming down now. It seemed like what we were seeing was a spike. And so I think that's going to be really important. One thing I worry about a lot as a journalist is that when we cover, just talking about crime rising makes people think it's rising even more than it is. People think crime is rising, like even when it's really falling. And so that is a real challenge for the media, I think, how to cover this responsibly, because we should cover real things that are happening without kind of inducing this fear mongering, which tends to lead to what I would argue are just not evidence-based punitive policies.
Yes, I'll leave you for now with the thought that one of the risks of retirement I've discovered is having time to read the Metro section thoroughly, and reading it, I see where Donald Trump's American carnage came from. It's a view of what's happening in the country that's absolutely horrifying. Anyway, Emily Bazelon, thanks. Stick around. We're going to have a discussion session in a few minutes. But first, after having discussed domestic politics and developments all this time, we're going to take a look at some of the things that concern Washington that are unfolding abroad. The U.S. is strongly backing Israel and Ukraine in their wars, and the success of U.S. policy in both cases is often linked to American credibility in Asia. Would Washington stand up similarly for Taiwan, or is the U.S. unready to challenge Beijing? Those are some of the biggest foreign policy issues we face, and joining us to talk about those and perhaps others is Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Aaron's main concern is the Middle East, and he worked as an analyst and negotiator in both Republican and Democratic administrations. Aaron David Miller, always good to see you. How are you?
Robert, it's always good to see and hear you.
Let's start with Israel and Gaza. U.S. policy, as I understand it, is Joe Biden absolutely supports Israel's war aims, even though it appears that he differs with Bibi Netanyahu on what Israel's role after the war would be. And he says after the war, we can't go back to where we were before. It's on to a two-state solution, or progressing to it. Can that policy hold up? Can it yield results this year?
This year? I doubt it. I guess, first of all, as far as Gaza is concerned, why is the president's demonstrating preternatural support for Israel? Three simple factors. His persona. The presidential model here is Bill Clinton. They're a generation apart, and yet their love of Israel, their high regard for Israeli sensitivity, extremely strong and imprinted on both their political and emotional DNA structures. Second is the politics. Republican Party is the Israel can do no wrong party, Democratic Party divided. And I think the president has to be concerned about appearing weak or allowing the Republicans to paint him with a progressive sort of Democratic brush. And third is the policy constraints. The cruel dilemmas in this conflict, Robert, how to prosecute a war against Hamas when it is in fact embedded deeply in civilian populations, in hospitals, and avoid Palestinian casualties. We don't have a better answer for the Israelis with respect to that. How to surge humanitarian aid into Gaza during the course of this conflict. Half the population, 2.3 million people, half of those people are now displaced. Winter is coming. Who's going to tend to their needs? We don't have an answer for the Israelis. And finally, on the day after question, which is now a thought experiment, it may well depend on how this conflict is going to end. And I don't think Pythia, the oracle at Delphi, reading the best of Godin trails, could tell you right now how it's going to end. So yes, the administration stands behind Israel with some asterisks. As far as the two-state solution is concerned, Biden did make this huge, huge statement. A few words, breathtaking scope, head exploding, really, that we cannot go back to October 6th. What that means in practice is a new reality in Gaza, largely driven, hopefully, by a legitimate, revitalized, to use Attorney Blinken's words, Palestinian Authority, and tethered, because you won't get Palestinians to participate without a broader American position and approach, serious and credible, on creating the least bad solution ending to the conflict, which is two states. Those are extremely heavy lifts. And in an election year, it's going to be, I think, very difficult for the administration to lift them.
Do you think, by the way, the Israeli government has said, or at least the defense minister and prime minister have said, this is a matter of several months, and whenever American officials, either President Biden or Secretary Blinken, have, I think every time they've discussed how long would be an appropriate operation, I believe they've spoken in terms of weeks. It's a pretty basic difference. Can you imagine? Can the United States tell Israel to wrap it up next week? Start moving out. Is that part of the relationship, or is that just unthinkable?
I mean, well, it can say anything it wants to the Israelis. The question is whether or not this administration is ready to impose any cost or consequence, if in fact the Israelis say no. And in 10 months, even before this crisis, in response to the most right-wing extremists, even Jewish supremacists, government in the history of the state of Israel, this administration has pursued what I would call a passive-aggressive policy. It's denied the prime minister a meeting at the White House and has not been serious about trying to do anything to constrain the Israeli policies on the West Bank, which essentially are annexationist in everything but name and continue to be. So again, it's leverage. Have we used it on the Israelis? We have in the past. Former President Bush, Secretary Baker, whom I worked, yes, was not in the midst of a crisis in the wake of brutality and the savage, sadistic, indiscriminate killing of civilians, which has left the Israelis traumatized and angry. So they'll stop when, in fact, they've satisfied themselves, I suspect, that they have enough to claim victory. And that's a very sketchy sort of ending, because I'm not entirely sure what that means.
Let's turn to Ukraine. There hasn't been a hugely successful Ukrainian offensive this past season. Russia seems to have stabilized its position there somewhat. Should the U.S. be open to the idea of a ceasefire on the terms of where the Ukrainians and Russians now stand, or would that be selling out the cause of Ukraine?
Again, the intersection between domestic politics and foreign policy, and I guess the notion of American credibility. I don't think that the administration is in any position right now, despite the paucity of results in Ukrainian counteroffensive, to essentially say to Zelensky, the 20% of Ukraine that you do not control, essentially we're gonna stabilize the lines, and it may not be a frozen conflict, but you maintain most of your country, and this is about all you're going to get. I think it's really hard for this administration, given its two basic assumptions. Number one, as long as it takes, and nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. You know, the average length of a war since 1816, according to the people who track these things, University of Chicago, is 3 months. If a war lasts beyond a year, according to their studies, it's likely to last 10. And I think what we have here is clearly a conflict that is going to continue, in large part because Putin has no stake or incentive. Sanctions haven't done it, and nor are there going to be internal disruptions in Russia that's going to prevent him from continuing to prosecute the war. So we're in for a long ride. And the question is whether or not the domestic consensus in the country, which is breaking to a certain degree, anything Israel wants, absolutely, but no on Ukraine with respect to many Republicans. That's going to that course is going to continue to rise the more we get into 2024 and the less results the Ukrainians can achieve on the battlefield.
One other question. I mentioned Taiwan. It seems that at least since the Obama administration, the U.S. has been trying to, quote, pivot to Asia, to acknowledge the significance of our relationship with China, the significance of Chinese ambitions in the region. Have we done it yet? That is, has the U.S. managed to give the Far East the amount of attention it deserves, or does the Middle East keep on dragging us back there?
Well, clearly no one anticipated this, but the pivot to the Indo-Pacific, if you read the National Security Strategy paper a year or so ago, clearly says we've invested way too much of our time and resources in the Middle East, and we need to pivot to Europe. This is before Russia and Ukraine, and to Asia. I think the administration has certainly bucked up its alliances out there, and yes, has shifted a significant amount of assets. The Taiwan question is another matter, though. And I guess the administration's strategy is to try to create enough deterrence and enough containment so that every time President Xi decides maybe I should do it now, his conclusion is, well, not now, because I don't think we have a strategy designed to prevent it should the Chinese seriously envision a invasion of Taiwan. I'm not sure we have the what is required to stop them.
Yep. Stay with us, and I'm going to bring back Emily Bazelon and E.J. Dionne also for our discussion period right now. And first, I just want to ask each of you to comment on anything you've heard from your fellow panelists briefly that you either want to register your enthusiastic agreement with or your dissent with. EJ, what have you heard from Emily and Aaron that strikes you?
Well, I broadly agree with Aaron's analysis. And the only thing there is I do think there is a kind of rumbling for two states that you haven't heard for a long time. The possibility that is back on the agenda, or the fact that is at least back on the agenda, I think is a significant outcome of this terrible conflict and these awful attacks. I want to just go back to a couple of things Emily said. That she noted the Republican consultant she spoke with was talking about letting this issue go, the abortion issue go. I talked to a Republican pollster earlier today who said that every Democrat in the country should put a little statue of Justice Alito in their house and light incense to him every evening because of how much what he did and what he wrote has helped the Democratic Party all over the country. And I think you are hearing in Nikki Haley in the debate, she is trying to walk this line, and viewed in one way, it's a very evasive, I'm very right to life, but we must respect the others. If you read the English subtitles to what she was saying in English, what she is saying is this issue is a loser, we got to kick it away. And even Donald Trump, who appointed these justices, has signaled that he's kind of backing away himself from a result he used to brag about. One other point on crime, I appreciated Emily's conversation on that, was really striking in these Virginia legislative races where if you were watching television, it was as if we were in a presidential general election. You know, and there were House of Delegates and state Senate races. And for every ad the Democrats had on abortion, the Republicans had ads up on crime and trying somehow or other to say that the Democrat they were running against, no matter what they had said, was an ally of defund the police and all of that. That crime campaign didn't seem to work.
Yeah.
Now we are looking at some really close results, so maybe it got them votes, but in so many races, the abortion issue trumped the crime issue, and it also trumped the education issue. What elected Youngkin in 2021, attacks on critical race theory and parental control. There was a backlash against that backlash, I think, to some degree.
Yep.
And the education issue was back more to worrying about, hey, we're losing teachers in our schools. We got to figure out ways to get good teachers in again. So I think it was the hot buttons that really worked in Virginia in 2021 and Democrats thought feared would work going forward, seemed a little less powerful, but I still think we're going to hear a lot about crime and immigration.
Yes, on one of those issues, I should point out as a resident of Northern Virginia that the local school board elections, which are pretty granular local politics, elected rather conventional liberal members to school boards in Northern Virginia, where it had been thought that cultural conservatives who wanted to ban certain books had made a lot of noise in school board meetings, but turned out to not carry that many votes. Emily
There was
Bazelon.
some evidence of that elsewhere in Pennsylvania too. You're right.
Let's turn to Emily. Thoughts on what you've heard from your fellow panelists?
Well, I have a question for EJ. That's something I think about a lot related to what you were talking about in terms of the Republicans in the House. If you watch this and you care about the functioning of government, it just seems like a zoo and very frustrating. And then, the idea that they would the Republicans would push out Kevin McCarthy, but then wind up like kind of back in the same place is sort of confusing. Is there a way in which this dysfunction in some ways helps, or at least doesn't really hurt Republicans, because they're the party of skepticism about government? And so if you just sort of tear down Americans' view of a functioning government, that doesn't actually hurt you the way as if you're a sort of good government person, one might want that to matter. But I wonder if in a way it just makes everything seem impossible, and then a kind of pox on all your houses from at least some swing voters.
I once got an email from a Democratic reader who wrote, Republicans spend their campaigns saying government doesn't work and spend their time in office proving it. But I do think that when you look at the division of Republicans on these budget votes, about 55% or so voting to keep the government open, and 45% or so voting the way that would lead to a shutdown. I think what you're seeing is a division in the party between, there are no liberal Republicans anymore, and there aren't that many moderates, but there are still Republicans who kind of want government to function or understand that their job is to keep government functioning. And so they vote for these continuing resolutions to keep government going. But I think for nearly half the party, there is this view. For some, it's sort of libertarian. For others, it seems almost nihilist to say that a shutdown, especially on a Democrat's watch, is not a bad thing at all. But a lot of the older Republicans know they made that calculation before and it blew up in their faces. And that's why Johnson, despite how conservative he is, seemed to end up back at the position saying we got to keep the government open.
Aaron David Miller, just comments on what you've heard from the panel?
Well, just a kudo to both of them. I think what people in this country care about are clearly our domestic politics and domestic issues. I think it was George Will who said that when it comes to foreign policy, the American people want as little of it as possible. And I think that's fundamentally important as we go forward. The Constitution talks about effecting a more perfect union. It doesn't talk about perfecting a more perfect world. And I think the source of so much of our dysfunction lies at home, and it is critical that we somehow address it in an effort to be able to project our policy and our values abroad.
I'd like to ask all of you to comment on the most unusual thing that's likely to happen over the next 12 months, which is a criminal trial, at least one, of the most likely Republican candidate for president. We haven't had that before. Not many people have had that, frankly, before. And I'm just curious. One question that has arisen is, should at least in these central cases that are about the core accusation against Donald Trump, the federal January 6th trial and the Georgia trial, should they be televised? Should the federal courts make an exception? Perhaps, Emily, you can explain to us what that might entail to make an exception. Is it something that is important for Americans to see? Is it something that could turn into a circus, as the special prosecutor has said in a court filing he fears it might? Emily, let me ask you first. Would you you could, of course, end up covering one of these trials if even if it's not on television? But how big an event is this likely to be? How big an event should it be?
It's going to be a huge deal. It should be a huge deal. I think it should be televised. I mean, I'm a journalist. I like people to have more information in the world, not less. And I think that the way in which former President Trump is very skillful at using social media or TV, whatever's at his disposal, to give his own spin on what's happening, that would be very it's going to be important to have actual footage of what is happening in the courtroom. And I already think the lack of that in the New York civil trial involving the Trump organization has been problematic. So
in that case, Donald Trump can leave the courtroom where something has happened and instantly give but something has happened, but it's not available to the audience, and he can give a briefing on his spin on what just happened inside the courtroom.
Right. I think the problem is where your question began, the idea of making an exception. So I have generally been pretty resistant to the idea that so Trump is obviously this huge breaker of rules and norms. He's the exception all the time, right? The reason we haven't had a criminal trial or a series of criminal trials like this of a president or former president is that, he just presents this like unique scenario of doing a lot of things that prosecutors were interested in. So I generally think it's not great for the system to respond by then breaking its own rules, that to have a norm breaker then force our government or our courts into its own kind of norm breaking is a problem, both because then I think people who are uncertain or supporters of President Trump then get worried that, he's right. Like the Biden administration is politically persecuting him. See, they just broke all these rules or norms. So that concerns me. I do think that in the state court arena, which is true about the Fulton County, Georgia case, then you're in a situation where it is more normal for trials to be televised. And that would not be making an exception in a way that people could get super suspicious about. I think that trial, however, is likely to not take place before the election. It may be that none of these trials take place before the election, but that one seems like the least likely just because it's complicated and there are 19 defendants or however many are left now that various people have pled guilty. So I don't know. I guess I still would come back, even though I am nervous about making exceptions that are responses to President Trump. It does seem really important for this trial to be televised, or trials, and I really can't help but root for it as a journalist, because I think it would just be really good to have unfiltered information about what's happening in the courtroom in front of the public.
Aaron, do you have strong feelings about this?
After 2 impeachments and God knows how many violations and transgressions of American norms and civility, including, I might add, all of these indictments, Trump's base has not shrunk at all. He remains the presumptive nominee. I don't think the issue of whether it's televised or not is key. The question is, if there are trials before the election, will he be convicted? That, in any of it, that appears to be some kind of, I don't know, red line that seems to trigger movement in the polls. So the issue to me is conviction. I'm not sure, frankly, that even a conviction is going to dent the popularity of this man.
EJ?
I think two things. One, I think a conviction, there's some polling, including some one by the New York Times, and there was another out there that suggests that a conviction could move some share of voters, that some piece of the Trump constituency, not the hardcore base, but people who are voting for him over Joe Biden might move away and say, we don't want a convicted felon as president. I agree with Emily on the broadcasting the trial. It's the first time I think I've ever agreed with Trump's lawyers and not with Jack Smith's reply. And I think the reason is straightforward. We live in this time of misinformation, disinformation, a lot of propaganda. The Trump folks are already saying that these trials are illegitimate and they're political. And I think if people could actually watch the process and have it all in public, there would be less opportunity for that. It's not to say people still won't try to distort what happened, but you know, it's always better to be able to say, do you believe him or your own eyes? And so I'd really like these trials to be public.
Here's a question for Aaron David Miller and whoever else wants to comment on it. The question is, considering that Mahmoud Abbas is 88, his birthday is November 15th, by the way, and he is in the 18th year of a 4-year term as Palestinian president, and considering Israel's determination to oust Hamas from power, is there a credible Palestinian leadership that could take over in Gaza once the fighting stops?
There's a credible Palestinian leader or leaders, collegial, that might, if Mahmoud Abbas passes from the scene. Gaza is another proposition now, because it requires a degree of legitimacy that no West Bank leader right now has. Mahmoud Abbas or his successor, with one exception perhaps, Marwan Barghouti, who's serving 5 lifetime sentences, who appears to have cred, not just with Hamas, but with the general Palestinian public. But I don't see any leader any West Bank leader under these circumstances that could ride into Gaza on the back of an Israeli Merkava tank under these circumstances. Interestingly enough, on October 6th, a poll was done by the Arab Barometer in cooperation with Khalil Shikaki's polling organization. 790 respondents. So October 6th, before the 7th. Who would you vote for as Palestinian Authority president? 12% for Abbas, 28% for Ismail Haniyeh, the
head of Hamas, the
political
leader, Hamas,
and 30+% for Barghouti.
Yeah.
So I think that sort of answers the question in terms of how Gazans feel about Abbas. Now, I don't think in these circumstances you need an empowered Palestinian leader, and the only way to do that, seems to me, is to put in process a political effort to end Israel's occupation through negotiations, and I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Okay. Here's a question for EJ and whoever else is interested. What are the prospects of a third-party candidate influencing the presidential race?
I think they're pretty substantial given how close the margins are likely to be in the swing states. Biden had a pretty healthy margin in Michigan, but it was about 80,000 votes. In Pennsylvania, it was, if I remember right, in the 2022 or something like that, in Wisconsin, and about 10,000 in Arizona and Georgia. So a third-party candidate, as in 2000, as in 2016, could have a big effect. There's a debate about which candidate would take the most votes from whom, but I think the consensus of the pollsters, the Wall Street Journal had a pretty good study of this, is that the third party is more likely to take from Biden than from Trump. And certainly a moderate or moderate conservative candidate on like a no labels ticket would seem more likely to hurt Biden. So yes, a third party candidate could have an enormous effect on the race. And then that Cornel West I don't know how many ballots, how many states he's going to get on the ballot on. But he could take votes away from Biden. He could also have a demobilizing effect on the black vote, which could be hard for Biden. And, the Green Party hurt Hillary Clinton the last time, and certainly hurt Al Gore in 2000. So I think the effect could be substantial.
Any other thoughts on third-party candidates this year? Or? No,
I mean, just to say the very obvious to back up EJ, it could very likely be super close. And so then even someone who just shaves off a fraction of votes in a few key states could swing the election.
I guess one piece of news recently about the coming elections is that Joe Manchin of West Virginia won't seek re-election. He's the West Virginia senator, the only Democrat who's been able to win statewide in that state for quite a while. Evidently, he didn't look too good from winning statewide this year. But does that mean, AJ, that it's a 51-49 Democratic majority in the Senate right now, and West Virginia is essentially a write-off to the Republican Party, we think? What does that do to the Democrats' chances of maintaining any majority in the Senate?
Oh, it's going to be very hard, even if Manchin had lost, which would have lost a seat for them. If he had stayed in the race, the Republicans were going to have to spend quite a bit of money and pay a lot of attention to that race. It's why Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, made sure a whole lot of money got spent early knocking Joe Manchin. Those ads were to encourage Joe Manchin to make the decision that he made. And almost all of the vulnerable seats or potentially vulnerable seats are held by Democrats. To have, when Democrats are talking about making Florida competitive or Texas competitive, which is not impossible given the current polls, but if those are your hopes for competitive seats, to take away from the Republicans, how tough this map will be for them.
But the Democratic, the vulnerable seats would be Ohio, Sherrod Brown, and Tester in Montana.
Those are probably two at the top of the list, but there are several others where Democrats will probably win, but have to fight for them.
And we heard. I'm curious to hear the thoughts of all of you on this. I mean, we heard. I guess EJ mentioned Nikki Haley, the former South Carolina governor and UN ambassador, and her performance in the debates, trying to as you described it, EJ, get away from the abortion issue. Who appears to be? Let's assume that Donald Trump, either by virtue of indictment or guilty plea or whatever might happen, or change of public opinion, let's assume he isn't the nominee. Who does appear to be the strongest contender to you among those who are seeking the nomination? Would it be Haley, DeSantis? I guess Chris Christie seems to have faded, but does any one of those appear to be a particularly strong opponent for Joe Biden next November? Any thoughts, EJ?
The recent polls show that Haley would probably be the strongest. Ron DeSantis has run a really terrible campaign. It's worth remembering that after the 2022 elections, DeSantis was running ahead of Trump in the polls. And some ascribe the indictments of Trump as having mobilized his base, and maybe there's something to that. But also DeSantis has just made one mistake after another, from that flawed announcement on Twitter to saying, Ukraine is kind of a local territorial dispute, one thing after another. And he's just hasn't been a particularly appealing candidate. His strategy seems to be to try to take away Trump's core. That's who he's appealing to, and Trump's core is unlikely to move. And now with everyone else dropping out, Haley seems the obvious alternative. And, there's a lot of talk that Chris Christie, who's got a real ceiling on him because, anti-Trump Republicans are only 10 or 15% of that party, that if he endorsed Haley in New Hampshire, where he's getting about 10%, that could make it interesting. I mean, you know, if you bet now, you'd have to bet on Trump. But we've seen dynamics in primaries change quickly. Gary Hart got 17% in Iowa in 1984 and swept into New Hampshire because he was the second place candidate. So is that possible? Yeah. Is it likely? Probably not. But I think she's the one most interesting to people right now.
Here's a question for Aaron David Miller from somebody who's attending in the audience. To what extent do you think Israel's cracking down on settler violence in the West Bank might contribute to establishing the credibility of the Palestinian Authority? That is, would a crackdown on settler violence against Palestinians enhance the credibility of the Palestinian Authority?
It would, and would also diminish the authority and the street cred of any number of armed groups, young men, some associated with Hamas, some with Palestine Islamic Jihad, but some who are actually independent. The Novelist Brigades being one, it would help enormously. But in with a prime minister that is clearly anxious about the stability of this coalition, it's hard to imagine that he's going to take at least 2 repeated warnings, one publicly by the president, basically to put a stop to this sort of settler vigilantism. And it clearly is not happening.
As we're drawing to a close, I want to ask a question about mood of the country of all three of you, which is, if you were to try to, or when you try to describe to yourself what American life feels like at this particular moment, in this peculiar moment in its relationship with Donald Trump and its politics, wars that we're indirectly engaged in. How would you describe where we are as a country right now and as a people, and what our sensibility is? It's unfair for me to pick any of you to go to first, so I'll try Aaron.
I think you know, had you asked me that question in the 60s, maybe in the 70s, I probably could have sought to encapsulate a mood of the majority of Americans. I'm not sure I can. And I think that has a lot to do with the atomization of our politics and the fact that identity politics, interest politics have so fragmented and segmented the country that it's hard to describe. I mean, we can describe the mood. I mean, inflation, as EJ indicated, it may be trending down, but it's still painful for so many people. There's enormous uncertainty. Immigration is still a critically important issue, and the headline there and the trend lines don't look good. Faith in our institutions seems to be diminishing and declining. To what extent most Americans care about that, I don't know. I asked someone the other day, could you imagine any issue that would impel hundreds of thousands of Americans week after week after week, 41 weeks to be exact, to go out into the streets and to fight for a relatively unified conception of what America is all about? And the answer was no.
Yeah.
And my answer is no as well. And that should tell you something about where we're headed.
Emily?
I wonder if we're going to look back on this moment, or maybe on kind of Biden's first term up until the Hamas attacks and the war in Gaza, as this kind of calm before the storm. I mean, I realize that the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is also part of the picture, but I feel like we've spent so much time fighting as Americans among each other over things that are important, but perhaps have distracted us from the kind of common project of a wealthy society that in which there's much room for improvement, but also relative to the rest of the world, we have a lot of good fortune, and that the negativity of this era is kind of out of proportion with the number of problems that we really have had. I have this sense of foreboding that the next period could be grimmer. And so that makes me wonder if we're going to look back somewhat fondly on this
These are the good old
period.
days, you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say because we don't know what's going to happen next, but I have been thinking about that a lot lately.
And EJ, you have the last word and a short one, I'm afraid.
I so want to say I'm really, really hopeful about everything. But I think the mood of the country is unsettled, deeply unsettled and grumpy. And as Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General, said, post-pandemic, a lot of people are lonely as well. Just to go to Aaron's point, we agree that the country is headed in the wrong direction. 78% of us in a recent AP poll. But we are completely divided on the reasons for this. There are many Americans who say Donald Trump's presence in public life poses a direct threat to our democracy and he must be stopped. And Trump's supporters say that all of this is the fault of liberals and cultural change that they can't stand, and Joe Biden and other people. And so I think Americans hate being divided, and they're completely divided about how to get rid of the division. Yeah. So it's a very difficult moment for us, I think.
Well, thanks to all of our guests, E.J. Dionne, Emily Bazelon, and Aaron David Miller. Many thanks as well to Joshua Plout, Roni Giuliano, and Ryan Sutton from American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, which produces Global Connections, and also to our technical director, Bobby Grandone. Our program sponsor is the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. It's a 501c3 national charitable organization which represents in the United States Israel's largest hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petach Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv. The website is www.afrmc.org. And this special message this month, at this time when Israel and Hamas are at war, please consider a donation to AFRMC's Emergency Medical Relief Fund to help the hospital in Israel as it handles wartime casualties. You can donate online at www.afrmc.org. Join us next month for our program Freedom of Speech on Campus. I'm Robert Siegel, and this has been Global Connections Navigating the New Normal. See you next month. Stay healthy and stay safe.